this is the house. My family actually comes from Punjab. And my father, when he came to Aligarh, and he loved reading and books, and the three children were born in Aligarh. So we were all very Urdu speaking in a different world. And I was the last child. And they generally had one boy, one girl, so they were hoping for a boy. And then I arrived. I found my father's life much more interesting. He was traveling and he was going out, and my mother was always trying to me, if I don't behave properly and nobody will marry me. But my father somehow, he said, you can do anything you like in life. So I sort of used to trail him around. I was maybe 3 years old. They sent a plane, Tiger Moth, for a joyride. And my father, you could take a child in his lap, and he said, I will take you for a ride. And I didn't know what fear is, and I was fascinated. So that was my first plane ride. And then you see, how the cities are laid. And it was, I think that got me hooked on flying. A week or so after, there was another father who took his daughter and the plane crashed. And I told my, I want to go and see it. And I went, and that image I have never forgotten. The body, of course, they have taken out. But this structure, the plane was still there. Somehow it had stayed with me. And at the end of the day, all those images come back to revisit you. Children feel safe with their parents. And I didn't know that, one night we just heard that mob was coming. I was about to lie in bed, and then suddenly there was we could hear the crowd. Women are the first girls of war, because killing and raping and whatever. So at that time, we all traveled by trains. And I think the worst thing, nobody talks about it, like it never happened. Most of the trains were burned, both sides, millions of people. We were put in a truck through, the road, the Daryaganj. There were dead bodies there was blood, and nobody will come out to pick them up. And they were rotting. And I really have, as a child, has never seen what violence is. And then we came to Delhi. A lot of Muslims have opted to go to Pakistan. But my father stayed back, and my brother was supposed to finish college. So we went to Delhi, and there was a refugee camp. It was in Purana Kila, where all the refugees, but we stayed with one of my uncles. I think that way we were very lucky. My family. Nobody was killed, but I think the scar lives, is sort of, and it comes to revisit you at the end of the day. And I never thought that after 70 years, it will come back. I got married, and then I realized that what a mistake I had made, because I wanted to do things, and marriage is, you have to be a wife. And I really didn't enjoy being a wife, because he was the master. So when we sat on the dining table, I always sat at the head of the table. And I wanted to be in charge of things, you know. I didn't think that I will become an artist. I just wanted to be an architect, build a city. I, uh, I think I was interested in calligraphy. I think in every language, the letter. And I feel I have lived a life in translation. They said, you know, why don't you translate your titles? But I said, I don't want to. So he said, oh, you think you're an artist in Urdu? And I said, I'm not ashamed of it. You know, I have been here 40 years in New York City, living in somebody else's country. गैर की बस्ती है कब तक? But it's very simple. This is not my basti. It is a stranger's land. But it's a horrible thing, you know. After 40 years, I don't consider this my home. Where is home? I mean, it's just in one's imagination. Like Lorca saying that all great art has an edge of melancholy. When I had the show, and there was this woman, and she came and she was crying, and I said, why? Because I thought, what do they see in my work? And she said, it's sort of longing for home. I mean, we were sort of killed, persecuted, put in concentration camps. When I'm alone at night, I have a conversation with myself. I said, why? What was I thinking? Why did I come here? I mean, I still wish that I had stayed rest of my life in that house. But the house has sort of fallen down, and I always say that it's fell from the weight of memories. You know, I long to go home, but I can't.
You just witnessed the premiere of this beautiful slideshow. It was just put together today at the last minute, and of course it features the amazing reflections of Zarina, and we are here to both celebrate but also to explore the work of Zarina, the amazing exhibit that is in our gallery space. I want to encourage all of you to go see Zarina Dark Roads at the 7-8 Washington Muse Gallery. And it's also a chance to kind of talk and unpack her work a little bit with three fantastic young scholars who are who have been working with her and talking in various kind of thinking about the issues that she raises in various ways. The show is a rare treat. It's the first time, and I just can't get over this honor, but it's the first time that this work, many of the pieces have been shown, but also these pieces have come together in an amazingly, frighteningly coherent way, asking these foundational questions about home and about migration and about refugee status that is, of course, not just about partition and a certain moment of Zarina's and so many millions of people's experiences, but of course the larger question of forced migrations, detention camp surveillance, refugees, that sadly has become even more important and more urgent today, if we can even begin to try to compare moments in which these crises have happened. So we're in for kind of an amazing configuration of opportunities. So I really want to encourage you to go see the exhibit, and of course tonight. And so I wanted to first of all thank Zarina for the amazing narration and gathering these images, and of course you as a young girl. It's fantastic. I mean, it's just, and I also wanted to thank the kind of staff, the student staff at APA who at the last minute were able to help put this together as a fantastic slideshow. So Emily Ho and also Shalimar Coloma, so thank you very much. And also I just want to acknowledge Elizabeth Marzano, who is also here, who has been working with Zarina as her assistant. So thank you for pulling all that together. Oh, okay, sorry, I should have, yeah. Oh. Okay, so she was just saying her two assistants have been working with her, are her two guardian angels, so, and you'll get a chance to meet them later on. Well, no, I'm not going to ask you. I'm looking at Elizabeth, and she's saying, don't ask her to stand up. So don't, okay, I'm not going to ask you to stand up. But, let me just give a brief introduction to Zarina, not so much about a biographical introduction, but talking about the show a little bit and what that really says about her, but also the framing in which she understands the experiences, the contemporary experiences that we're all grappling with ourselves today. As you enter, we have a small gallery. We're in one of those small townhouses on the Mews. And the first section, there's a tiny kind of digital print of a house. And it's not revealed at all what that house is, but of course you know it's something personal, but it's untitled. And it's, this darker kind of print that's on Indian handmade paper from 2014. And then by the time and I should just say that by the time, this is a show full of woodcuts. And that piece is flanked by maps of cities called Home, a series. The first one is Aligarh, which is your birthplace. The second one is Bangkok, Delhi, Paris, and New York. New York seems to be the place you've stayed in some ways the longest. And the irony, of course, is that even though it's the longest place, we tend to think, oh, this feels homey, this feels like home, but it's not home, right? And then on the other side of that beautiful print is this amazing large woodcut called Dividing Line. And it's a gash, a chasm. It appears time and again in the show. It becomes this incredibly important small photo print, small digital print, excuse me, that is a bit mysterious because we don't quite know what it is. But by the end of the show, of course, it becomes very clear. By the end of the show, there's a vitrine with a beautiful fold-out, accordion fold print on both sides of a series of roads, intersections, spider roads coming off of that. And then on the back is a poem. And I haven't had a chance to ask Zarina and to kind of check with all the cartographic details, but adjacent to that beautiful accordion print is this poem that is called, let me just try to enlarge it so I can actually read it. It's called Directions to My House, done in 2001, I believe, yeah. And I'll just read you excerpts of it. Directions to My House. When you come out of the train station, take a rickshaw to the Tarwala Bangla. You will come out on Railway Road. On your left is Nakvi Park. Next to the Gothic-looking clock tower, Railway Road becomes University Road. On your right is Lao Digi, a big pond full of water chestnuts. On your left is Victoria Gate, the main entrance to the campus. Continue on University Road. At the crossroads, turn right onto Shimbli Road. The name is carved in red stone in English and Urdu. Follow the gravel road. It should not take you very long to get there. It is only 7,438 miles away. Just an incredibly beautiful kind of bookend to that digital print of her home. Of course, it was the home that you saw in the slideshow. In between, of course, is all these years, decades, in which the kind of reckoning with the memories and the house that's fallen down with all those memories has caused Zarina to understand how what she has felt and experienced and expressed through the woodcuts especially are linked to the questions that we are now looking at in the daily headlines, or how those daily headlines quickly move to the backs of the paper as new crazy stupid tweets emerge, right? In which we lose perspective of what's important in life and what's not important, and what are the true global events that we should be paying more attention to and are ignoring. So it's really this show and Zarina's sustained work over so many decades that I thought would be a fitting introduction, just to give you a little sense of what we're in for tonight. So we're really delighted to have three fantastic scholars, intellectuals, people who've been kind of engaging with these kinds of questions. And to introduce them is someone I just had the opportunity to meet for the first time today, Sadia Shirazi. And she is, just to give you a little sense, and you can read, of course, this bio in the program, is an independent curator, writer, and architect. And I really thought that her dissertation description is kind of fantastic. It's about translation, untranslatability, and the withdrawal in global art practices of artists. And as I understand it, Zarina is actually figuring significantly in that research. So it's my honor and privilege to just say a few words of introduction. Before Sadia comes up, I just wanted to give my deepest appreciation to the APA staff that has really made this all possible. It's the work of Amita Magnani, who a lot of you know, and she's the one who's there. Now she's giving the cue cards about when to finish, and she's going to give me a card very soon right now. But also Laura Chen-Chotes, our deputy director, who's also tending the bar back there and checking your IDs, and also Ruby Gomez, and a fantastic student staff. So thank you all for the great work you've done in making this possible, and congratulations on this incredible show, Zarina. We look forward to having you join us up here. And without any more delay, Sadia, if you could come up and join us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jack, for the introduction. And I am going to begin by also introducing one of our panelists who will speak now. I'd also like to echo the thanks that Jack's just given to the whole APA staff. It's been really wonderful working with you all. And also thank you to the panelists for joining us today. And of course, Zarina Appa, for both the opportunity to moderate and for the openness with which you've spoken to me since we met almost 5 years ago now. And for the thing I treasure most in the process of my research and ongoing writing on you, which is our friendship. So our first speaker will be Vazira Zamindar, and apologies for flipping back and forth. But Vazira is a historian of modern South Asia with an interest in 20th century histories of decolonization, nation-state formation, displacement, war, resistance, and the visual archive. Her book, The Long Partition and the Making of Modern South Asia, was published by Columbia University Press in 2007. The Indian and Pakistani editions of the book came out in 2008, and the Urdu translation in 2014. She While minorities, partitions, and refugees remain enduring concerns, she's presently working on a book on the history of archaeology, visual practices, and war on the northwest frontier province of British India and on the borderlands with Afghanistan, and has received the International Institute of Asian Studies Fellowship, Fulbright, National Endowment for Humanity Fellowship, amongst others. Please help me welcome her to the stage.
I'm going to read some of my comments and thoughts, really centered around this one work, but will venture through some others as part of thinking with it. The cartographic line on degree paper wields an edifice of power. The massive army of surveyors that conquered imperial lands included sappers and coolies, draftsmen and photographers, civil engineers and printmakers. Both the camera and the aeroplane were almost instantly harnessed to the technologies of surveying, and along with plane tables, pendulum clocks, odometers, altazimuth, theodolites, a presumption of precision and abstraction, measurement with a claim to representation, subdued a landscape onto paper. Notes on the drawing of New Standard Maps from 1870 provide instructions for the size of lettering to be used for important and less important place names. The glossary of vernacular terms used in the Survey of India maps, for example, distinguish between Dagh and Dasht, or the method of constructing the International Atlas of the World on a scale from 1 to 1,000,000 explains the problems of scaling an entire world into lines on paper. These documents from a massive imperial archive that became our national inheritance everywhere revealed the accumulation of mundane bureaucratic regulation that came to govern and give aesthetic and not just scientific authority to the cartographic line. Guarded as secrets of modern militarized statecraft on the one hand, and widely dispersed through a fiercely schooled cartographic literacy on the other, we respond to cartographic lines, as distinguished from other kinds of primeval lines, with immediate recognition. And they condition our very worlding, our understanding of where we are and where we cannot go. As you know, the Boundary Commission in the summer of 1947 was not made up of cartographers or geographers. Yet Cyril Ratcliffe, a judge, and the rest of his commission, made up of jurists, relied entirely on maps, largely from the 1920s and 30s, which had been unevenly updated by aerial surveys, pre-Graflex cameras set on aeroplanes, as the world wars had depleted the manpower of the department, as the Survey of India was then called. The cartographic line is as such also a juridical line that territorializes sovereignty and determines who can have, to use Anna Arendt's words, the right to have rights and the right to belonging. Like a good lawyer, Ratcliffe destroyed every shred of paper associated with the crime. So all we have is his final award. Ratcliffe included 3 maps to accompany the textual description of his August 12th Boundary Award. The 3 maps included a sketch map that was sent in advance to the governor of Punjab, Jenkins, as ethnic cleansings were making their own bloodlines. And the second map was a map of Kasur Tehsil, where the words had proved inadequate to explain its tricky terrain. The third, however, was extraordinary, a composition of 7 1-inch to 4-mile maps that were aligned hurriedly together with Scotch tape, and a black line, a 1/4 of an inch thick, ran through them to mark the new boundary, the territorial limits of the two new nation states. The black line, if considered in scale, was a mile wide, an abyss. So many of Zarina's works mime the cartographic line. The semblance of regulation of line and letters renders them recognizable as cartographic. From cities I called home to these cities blotted into the wilderness. But in mimesis, although it is the semblance that gives us our first recognition, there is an alterity, an opposition built into the very same line. As such, the lines in Zarina's work draw upon all the power wielded by cartographic lines, as well as their ghouls, their shadows. The map of Srebrenica is both a map of Srebrenica and simultaneously a graveyard. Ahmedabad is a divided city and emptied of its soul. The dividing line that earlier Jack mentioned as well, Amir Mufti once described it as a gesture of staggering economy, and it intensifies our apprehension of this mimesis. For we immediately recognize the technological, bureaucratic, political, juridical Ratcliffe line, and at the same time, its absurdity. As Mufti asks, what does it indeed divide? And it is here, between the line and its double, that the primeval reverberation is set in motion. If the cartographic line can be described in words, and alas, Ratcliffe gave his textual description of the award legal precedence over the very lines that had guided the writing of his text, if the cartographic line can be taken apart and explained, or what we historians call historicized, the mimesis of this line at the same time represents the limit of history, the inability to give an account, a description, or an explanation. There is the making of historical sense, say, of something we name and date as the Partition of 1947, and its irredeemable shadow, the nonsense, a refusal to give sense to something we may name and date as such. The abyss inverts the darkness. The abyss inverts the darkness, and the recognizable Ratcliffe line becomes instead a precipice. It is not a solid line, though, rendered as a multitude of lines which could be seen as an opening up of the cartographic line's closures. However, as a precipice to an abysmal darkness on either side, it is the only line of sight offered to us, fragmentary as it necessarily must be, the only line of sight of possibility of possible habitation. Hannah Arendt, writing from the middle of a long and terrifying 20th century, I would argue this very precipice articulated a new predicament of statelessness in a world reduced to nation states. In her words, when belonging to a community into which one is born is no longer a matter of course, and not belonging no longer a matter of choice as well. Statelessness, this line of sight that in abyss is both historically specific, one could name and place it as Partition 1947, and at the same time of our age, is a political condition, as Arendt explains, that includes both minorities and refugees, those rendered xenos as in strange or foreign, within the territorial limits represented by the cartographic line, and those rendered xenos by crossing those very limits. Statelessness. This inseparability of minority and refugee as a historical and political category that elucidates the contradictions of national citizenship and the daily denationalizations and incarcerations, the daily denationalizations and incarcerations and episodic murders and expulsions, political violence that we struggle to end, and violence that always seems to exceed our struggle. In Zarina's fragmentary line of sight, this statelessness is the terse limit and the conditional possibility that I would argue moves through much of her re-territorializing mimetic cartographies, her worlding. The counterpoint to statelessness is arguably not simply the concrete right to have rights. Rather, it also includes the far more ambiguous right to belonging as well. And it is precisely when belonging to a community into which one is born is no longer a matter of course, and not belonging no longer a matter of choice, that this right to belonging must also make its appearance. Here in this dark print of a photograph that we saw earlier as part of the slideshow, mimesis of a mimesis, Zarina's family home on the campus of Aligarh Muslim University, a home she had grown up in, a TV antenna against a blackened sky. If you think about the photograph and this image, TV antenna against a blackened sky, a graying, redolent garden set around an inconspicuous government house, and the light slowly leaving the image, If I'm conflating the right to belonging with the longing for home, or what is called nostalgia. I know the word melancholy came up earlier, but the word longing for home, nostalgia, it is because of the change of emotion in this work, from reverberations of epoch-defining precarity to that of irretrievable loss, captured here in this image of a childhood home that is darkening in both memory and in materiality. Nostalgia, once a medical term coined by a Swiss doctor in the 17th century to express from the force of the sound of the word nostalgia, of the word itself, the sad mood originating from the desire for return to one's native land. This individuated longing for home, a condition arguably of all exile, Arendt and Zarina alike, could be considered, as Svetlana Boym insists in her lovely work, The Future of Nostalgia, where the homey and the uncanny are not retrograde, are not simply a violent desire for the restoration of home or homeland, as we see in many return to the past movements, but instead an acute aesthetics of retrieval, reflection, and staying with the loss, a spatialization of a country that no longer exists, can no longer exist, may not exist. As the light leaves the image, there is a disappearance, there is a disappearance, and at the same time an insistence to home that is in its photographic mimesis rather than the cartographic. A shadow that is a shadow that brings us back to that longing that was so beautifully expressed in Zarina's own words. The home, I long to go home, but I cannot. Insistence on home rather than a recuperation of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Vazira, for that beautiful presentation. So the exhibition, Dark Roads, that's on view at the APA Gallery, presents 3 decades of Zarina's work from roughly the 1980s to the present. The oldest work in that exhibition is Flight Log, a cast paper sculpture from '87. I will situate Zarina's practice a bit further back historically, beginning in the 1960s with her time in Paris at William Hayter's printmaking workshop, Atelier 17. This image is from a catalog, an exhibition catalog of Zarina's, and you can see it's the same image that she used in her presentation, but of her in Atelier 17, which was a printmaking workshop founded by William Hayter, a British artist. Zarina was one of many artists and students coming to Paris from the former colonies of Africa, the Caribbean, and South Asia, who then lived and worked in the city in the post-independence period and post-World War II era, as it's known in Western art historical frameworks, contributing immensely both to artistic movements in that city and their home nations, whether or not they could or did return to them. This is an image of Krishna Reddy and William Hayter in Paris in the 50s. And this is an image of the William Hayter's the Atelier 17. I consider Zarina's practice as a bridge between the burgeoning post-independence art movement in Delhi in the 1960s and the feminist and conceptual art scene in New York in the 1970s. This means situating her work both within practices of modernism in Delhi at that time and the feminist art movement in New York at that time, which Zarina was actively engaged in. Her sculptural practice, her engagement with materiality, temporality in architecture, refuses both the emphasis on vision and the ocular as a fixation of modernist American art, as well as the monumental scale of architectural modernism. These next images that I'll show are early works of hers from the late 60s when she would have been in Delhi, if I'm correct. And these are, to me, very interesting images because they are quite playful with the kind of craft of printmaking at that time. So these are not produced from carving into a wood block, but instead are relief prints from collaged pieces of wood. And in conversation with Zarina in her studio, she has told me, if I'm not incorrect, that when she was in Delhi in the 70s, in the late 60s, sorry, she had seen pieces of wood that were kind of strewn on the side of the road and had picked them up, brought them back to her studio, washed them, oiled them, and then printed these works from them. And this is a work that's called Untitled from '68. This is called Cage from around the same time. And this is called The Kiss. Iftikhar Dadi argues that the term Islamic art is a catachristic signifier, which means without an adequate referent. Islamic art, in this sense, is a field of Western construction. Extending this analysis further, calligraphy and the decorative arts, such as bookmaking, and the decorative arts or crafts, such as bookmaking, metalwork, and textiles, all fail to line up with primary Western fine art categories of sculpture and painting, Dadi explains. In this way, when Zarina speaks of her interest in something like calligraphy, or when in previous presentations on her, I've heard her work referred to as not making a distinction between sculpture and architecture, because a lack of a kind of separation actually within traditions in South Asia of those two forms. Zarina's work contributes to complicating these categories within both Western art historiography and creating expansive conditions of artistic production in Indian art history. Zarina's work emerges out of an interest in and an engagement with the material paper, which she prints on, casts, sculpts with, and this too playfully. If Bauhaus-inspired modernist architecture is interested in concepts such as transparency and legibility, in which its construction is made visible through its modes of circulation, Zarina's approach to architecture is instead to register the play of light and shadow on a floor, in which architecture is the backdrop that registers moments and seasons, the rain passing through blinds during the monsoon, the fragrance of jasmine, a dust storm. Her memories are seared onto paper and are the memories of very particular bodies in a particular space with particular abilities, who do not register perhaps in the national consciousness, who are not perhaps imaged as themselves, but whose belonging is multiple and who as multiple and who then posit a challenge to representational politics within the frame of the national subject or citizen. Hayter founded Atelier 17 in 1933 in Paris, but moved his workshop to New York in 1940 when Paris was occupied by Nazi Germany with the support of Peggy Guggenheim. Artists such as Marcel Duchamp, Max Ernst, André Breton all frequented the studio, as did the emergent New York school associated with Guggenheim at that time that included Rothko, de Kooning, and Pollock. Down the street from Atelier 17 was Bob Blackburn's printmaking workshop that he established in 1948, an artist who Krishna later introduced Zarina to when she moved to New York. Krishna Reddy, when Zarina had arrived in Paris in the 60s, Krishna had already arrived in the 50s, and Zarina met him in Hayter when she arrived and began working in the studio. After Paris, Zarina returned to Delhi and was part of what I describe as a burgeoning post-independence art movement in India. She lived in Barsati, as did many other artists at that time who had formed communities in the neighborhoods of Nizamuddin and Jangpura. Artists from Bombay were also in Delhi at that time, including Akbar Padamsi, M.F. Hussain, and Gaitonde, as were artists who were already living in Delhi. Unlike artists who were working with figurative representation and narrative imagery in India at that time, Zarina's work was marked by its spareness, its use of abstraction, and its lack of color. Its aesthetic proved challenging to incorporate within Indian histories of modernism, which Geeta Kapoor historicizes in a, quote, chronological fix between nationhood and modernity. Iftikhar Dadi offers a counter-argument, noting that, quote, in Pakistan, modernist art did not simply work out an agenda framed by nationalism. None of the representational vehicles of imagination identified by Benedict Anderson, such as national language, the novel, census, map, and museum, are fully valid. I'm being told I have 2 minutes, so I'm just going to talk through the slides. This was just to say to put Geeta Kapoor's work and Iftikhar Dadi's in conversation is not to say that Zarina is in either or of those camps, but simply to complicate the idea of both Indian art historiography, which I think Zarina's work was difficult actually to write about through their reliance on this idea of a kind of belief in the nation and speaking to the citizen and the masses of a certain kind of hegemonic idea of the Indian citizen. And then I'll just speak through these images. But so these are images from a publication called Vrishchik, which means scorpion in Gujarati, that was published by Ghulam Muhammad Sheikh and Bhupen Khakkar, and that's Bhupen's image on the front. And it included in 1970, the same year that the Smithsonian had a printmaking workshop in Delhi at the American Museum. It included a conversation on printmaking with Zarina, Ghulam Muhammad. Nasreen was in the space, but Nasreen Mohammadi was in the space but didn't speak. Jyoti Bhatt and others. And the conversation is quite interesting, and it also includes an image of Zarina's cage in it. It's interesting, and it echoes this question of Zarina basically in it talking about how prints should be considered, in a sense, as art objects and shouldn't be considered secondary. And everyone in the discussion agreed that in India, prints had been given a kind of secondary status. This is the cover of the Heresies, feminist publication on art and politics, of their Third World Women issue, which Zarina participated in. She was on the editorial collective for this particular issue. So at that time, Heresies did not have any actually people of color on their primary editorial collective, and had to find folks in order for them to participate in this publication. There was quite a bit of tension, from what I understand, between this temporary kind of editorial collective that produced this issue and the Heresies collective at that time. What's interesting to me when I go through it is that Zarina, the essays are, when they deal with identity, they're primarily talking about kind of race within certain dichotomies of whiteness and blackness. They do include questions of indigeneity, as well as they also have, writing on indigeneity, and also writing by Latino feminist writers. Zarina's voice is not at all in this issue, but her work is, as is her kind of design and curation. She includes images by her friend at the time, an artist, Ana Mendieta, amongst others. This, in New York, from 79 to around 1985, Zarina also participated and taught at the New York Feminist Art Institute. This is one of their catalogs of the workshops that they offered, and she would teach basically a course on paper pulping. And there were performances, for example, by Caroline Schneemann, poetry readings by Natake Shange, amongst others. These are just a couple of images from the cover and the inside of that, explains the bios of the artists and the courses that they offer. I'm quite interested, of course, in Zarina's kind of work and the kind of sculptural quality of it, and the way in which her work, though it's dealing with minimalism, abstraction, does things in a very playful way. These are paper pulp sculptures that she made in the 70s, and this one is called Steps. This one is called Pool. And while these look quite hard or hard-edged, they were made from paper pulp and are actually they're quite light as structures. She also has a sculpture called Roofs that almost looks as if it's made in bronze, but is a series of these kind of roof structures in a grid that are pigmented gold. And again, the weight there, she kind of, she's playing with this idea of things that look heavy but are quite light. This is an image of Zarina, Krishna Reddy, and Judy Reddy in Asila in Morocco in the 1980s when they were participating in a printmaking workshop there. I included this image, which is called Undivided Line, and plays off of the image Abyss that was in Vazira's presentation. So this one is a bit earlier, and is much more legible when we understand it within this print as marking this kind of fault line that comes to define these two territorial boundaries, 2 or 3 territorial boundaries, if we include East and West Pakistan at that time. And what I wanted to say about this is that, the process of making this is quite important to think about, in that Abyss is made by carving out, gouging actually that line, which is that line, the cartographic line that Vazira so eloquently spoke about. But this is done exactly by the opposite. So it's carving out what would have been the positive print in that image. And so it's carving out all of the land in order to kind of create this very jagged line in the center, and the print is registering that line. And the process of that carving, the kind of repetition, the strength of the hand, I think is very important in thinking about her work and the way in which these images are produced. And that is the end of my presentation. I'm going to introduce now Anjali Kamat. Anjali is a journalist, documentary filmmaker, and writer from Chennai, India. She is currently the Bell Zeller Visiting Professor at Brooklyn College, a reporter with the Investigative Fund at the Nation Institute, and writing a book on migrant labor in the Middle East for Verso Books. She has covered wars and uprisings, criminal justice and civil liberties, and the impact of U.S. foreign policy and globalization on struggles for justice around the world for Al Jazeera's current affairs documentary series, Fault Lines, Democracy Now! Her work has won several awards, including a Peabody and 4 Emmy nominations. Please help me welcome her to the stage.
So I want to talk about some of the pieces, mostly the ones that deal with migration. So let me see if I can figure this out. All right. So All right, so I'm using this as an opportunity to think through Zarina's beautiful work and engagement with the violence of borders and the various shifting technologies of migration control, what seems to me like an insistence on the agency of migrants and refugees. So this piece, The Year of the Sinking Boats, I think speaks very well to how once in a very rare while the silent epidemic of death haunting the journeys of migrants and refugees bursts onto the news cycle and briefly dominates our social media news feeds, and we're forced momentarily to contend with the magnitude of the cruelty. Over the past couple years, it's been the image of the sinking boat in the Mediterranean or the Bay of Bengal that's come to define what's often called the refugee crisis. Sometimes it's the image of a dead body washed up on shore, like the body of 3-year-old Aylan Kurdi, that forces a pause. And this piece of a carefully folded piece of paper, a paper boat, is a fitting tribute to his memory and the countless other children who take these journeys, whose only relationship to a boat before their trip across the ocean might well have been just making or playing with one of these paper boats. Mostly, though, we are inundated by images of a crush of unnamed black and brown bodies pouring out of a flimsy boat or a rubber dinghy, shaking, broken, but unlike the countless others who died along the route, drowned, suffocated, injured, killed, or simply left behind to die because they were too weak to keep going, they're still breathing. I thought of this work, Lost Boat, which is one of the works by Zarina that really spoke to me this morning when I was reading an article by an Associated Press journalist about a man who lost his wife, son, and twin daughters on a boat journey from Myanmar to Bangladesh. The journey should have just taken a few hours, but ended up taking 18 hours because, as often happens, the boat was lost, drifting in the open seas of the Bay of Bengal for hours. Families, I think it was 45 or 50 families, were crowded together on this tiny boat, and they were forced to throw out their possessions along the way once the boatman realized with horror that they were lost at sea, and they were supposed to be traveling along a river and ended up in the open seas. They tossed out all their possessions. They were without food or water for hours, and the piece beautifully talks about this man's struggle with his family to kind of keep them going. And just as they came within sight of land, a storm passed over the sea, and a wave that he described as big as a mountain capsized the boat, leaving only a handful of survivors who reached the shores. This piece, Sinking Boat with a Heartbeat, I think speaks to this story and that of countless others who've made this sort of journey that we occasionally read about in the press. And it's the stories of the very few who survive and the really uncountable numbers of others who do not. But there's something sinister about this line, this heartbeat. There's the jagged line of the heartbeat. It's not simply that the boat has people in it as it's sinking who might still be alive, but there's also something about that line that seems to speak to the premonition of a border ahead. The knowledge that even if you survive this terrible journey, what awaits is barbed wire and a surveillance tower designed to keep you out. This piece also spoke to me, this sort of a similar theme of a barbed wire or a horizon in the distance. And governments wary of what they call migrant invasions like to talk about deterrence. Walls, fences, militarized borders, detention, and criminal sentences are just some of what they spend billions of dollars on, as if to say, in every way possible, you are not welcome here. Your odyssey was never worth it. The European Union has externalized much of its border control to North and Central African states, essentially bribing security forces in Algeria, Egypt, Ethiopia, Mali, Niger, Morocco, Senegal, and rivaling groups of militias in Libya with $2 billion to deter migrants by detaining and even torturing them, whatever it takes to keep them from reaching European shores. The logic of outsourcing migration control isn't that different, when you think about it, from what allowed the CIA to justify the extraordinary rendition of people picked up in Iraq and Afghanistan to prisons and interrogation centers in countries that could torture them with impunity. And these pieces by Zarina, the Book of Travels and the piece we just saw almost there, speak to this violence of the journey. And for those who persist, the logic of migration policies of various states tells us that the biggest deterrent along the way is death. Since the early 1990s, the US Border Patrol has had a policy called prevention through deterrence, which, by closing off all of the safe entry points into the US, forced migrants to travel through the Sonoran Desert, where, as anthropologist Jason de Leon describes, nobody knows how many people have died, and there's no one to keep count because of how quickly bodies decompose in the heat of the desert. It's the same calculus of callousness that accounts for the deaths in the Mediterranean and the Bay of Bengal, the Indian Ocean, and the Black Sea as migrants search for new and more dangerous routes to get to their destinations. As safe and legal routes are closed off, more and more people are pushed to risk these dangerous routes, paying with their life savings, their bodies, and their lives for the possibility of reaching safer ground. This piece is a very dark print of a boat floating on the sea of memory. And like the Rohingya man who lost everyone and has nowhere to go or to return to, and like too many other boats left to float for days without food or water at the mercy of the waves, the oceans and the deserts have swallowed innumerable loved ones, leaving the survivors floating on nothing but a sea of memory, a classic condition of exile. So as Mahmoud Darwish, the Palestinian poet, wrote, a poet of exile, a poet of the Palestinian refugee condition, we travel like everyone else, but we return to nothing. As if travel were a path of clouds, we buried our loved ones in the shade of clouds and between roots of trees. He also writes, echoing many of Zarina's themes about home, we journey towards a home not of our flesh. Its chestnut trees are not of our bones. Its rocks are not like goats in the mountain hymn. The pebble's eyes are not lilies. We journey toward a home that does not halo our heads with a special sun. The word migration today is often followed by the word crisis, which doesn't necessarily refer to the crisis of thousands of people dying on the journey, but the fact that they are arriving at our doorstep. While the debate rages on about how many and who to let in, who among these hordes at the gate might be worthy of entry, and the criteria are drawn up to determine their value, victims worthy of our sympathies or criminals to be locked up, war-torn refugees or labor migrants escaping debt and poverty, the immediate future spells confinement, simply for the crime of not belonging anywhere anymore. For some, the destination will be a refugee camp, which after months, years, and perhaps decades will turn into a semblance of home. For others, a migrant detention center or prison awaits, where private prison companies make money off every night a migrant spends inside. And for others still, a labor camp, where they're put to work at poverty wages and must keep working until they've paid off the debts they incurred to leave home in the first place. It's a grim vision of our dystopic present, and this piece, No Escape 1 and 2, particularly speaks to this sort of claustrophobic age of war, surveillance, militarized borders, xenophobia, and climate change that we're living in, where it can feel like there is no escape. And for many who leave home, fleeing war, poverty, persecution, or domestic abuse, and set off on an arduous journey fraught with danger, there's little rest or comfort at the end of the long road. But like the crumpled prayer in the pocket of a Central American migrant's body found in the desert in the film Who is Dayani Cristal, partir es un poco morir. To set off is to die a little. This piece, Starting Over, was one that really spoke to me from all of Zarina's works, because it speaks to the fact that the decision to leave home, like the entirety of the migrant's journey, whether to survive or in pursuit of a dream, can also be seen as an act of radical hope, using their bodies to rebel against the structural impossibility of escaping the precariousness at home, to embark on a journey so dangerous, to go into debt, to leave loved ones and all that is familiar, to risk the very high possibility of assault, dismemberment, and death, is to take a chance on the slimmest possibility of survival and refuse to submit to the nightmare that was once home. Each step of the migration process is a struggle against precariousness, a bodily insistence on presence against the crushing circumstances that are designed to contain their mobility. Enduring days of travel by foot over deserts and forests and rivers with little food and water, navigating new and complex landscapes, plotting their next move based on a calculus of contorting their body to fit into a rubber dinghy or the back of a van or the bottom of an airplane, surviving beatings, torture, and rapes. Every part of the migrant's journey is an act of embodied resistance, a search for a new place to call home, a starting over. I found a striking similarity between the techniques used in this and other of Zarina's pieces, gouging the surface, carving a line, puncturing the paper, to the embodied practices of migrants as they make their way across a difficult landscape, leaving behind the old story and creating a new narrative. And I wanted to end with just another few lines from Mahmoud Darwish, which speaks to this, I think. It's called, "I will slog over this road. I will slog over this endless road to its end. Until my heart stops, I will slog over this endless, endless road, with nothing to lose but the dust, what has died in me, and a row of palms pointing toward what vanishes." Thank you very much.
Of course, this is the work that Zarina has been working on for a number of years, but this, as I said earlier, we're really graced with the opportunity to kind of show this work together for the first time. I do want to encourage you to go. We actually pulled this show together in a fairly short amount of time, and it was really because of the two angels who are Yukari Edomitsu and Liz Marzano, as I'd mentioned Liz's name earlier. But also I want to mention and acknowledge Alexander Chang, who really also worked with Zarina and the support staff in making this show possible. And it was all really done in a very tight amount of schedule, and in fact Alex was working on this major exhibition, two-part exhibition in Los Angeles. So anybody who's in Los Angeles or going there the next few months, please go there. It's a fantastic exhibit called Circles and Circuits, and it's a two-part show. One is it's really on the history and art, contemporary art of Chinese Caribbean diaspora. So without any more delays, the panel.
So I'm going to start with a couple of questions, and then I was hoping to also give us the opportunity to ask questions of one another on the panel, if you have any to ask for the other speakers. So I think my first question was, Vazira, in your presentation, Zarina's work is kind of, used to illustrate the way in which is used to kind of almost illustrate a certain kind of representation of violence in cartography. And for you, Anjali, the work is evocative of certain sites of violence. And so in some way you help bring us to different sites of those violence and different experiences and conditions of migration, of migrants and refugees. But I was wondering if you guys could talk a little bit about that distinction and the difference between those two things. One is the act of cartography as a kind of, from your presentation I understand, as a kind of the violence of both the cartographic line and the violence of the nation state. And from yours, Anjali, the way in which Zarina's practice is not necessarily a representation of violence, but of these kind of other sites of possibility.
That's a very important question. I think the problematic of how to represent violence is one that I think has been quite important to a lot of thinking in both history and in anthropology, as well as I'm sure your discipline, art history. How do you represent violence in that by explaining the political or the structural or the institutional, you explain away the violence. In description, which is the form in which we read about violence in the newspapers, in descriptive form, there is a sensational provocation that journalist, in words, seeks, seeks to provoke us into responding to violence. And visually, this has been a really important, conversation, especially for photographers and photojournalists, with the crisis, the migrant refugee crisis, as you were speaking to Anjali. There was this controversy over a set of photographs that The Guardian did of the Rohingya refugee crisis, to use all of those words, in which all the color is taken out of those photographs. They're black and white images. I don't know if any of you have seen those photographs, and there was a lot of debate over a certain kind of staging of the suffering of others, to draw on, again, a very important and famous text by Susan Sontag on that very problematic. How do you represent violence? And on the one hand, we seek to do so to provoke us into reacting, to stop it, to intervene, to do something, right, to act. But it's very unclear, right, that whether photographs of violence, this removal of all color, and thus laying bare the expression of pain and devastation. Another word that comes to mind is catastrophe, right? That in fact leads us to some kind of action, and the kind of world we live in, and the kind of continuous news barrage that we have. It's clear that we aren't doing anything. I mean, we're simply, the violence goes on, and it constantly exceeds our ability to intervene in it. So for me, Zarina's work, in a way, especially as someone who's spent a lot of time thinking about the violence of the partition of 1947, is a work in, again, Mufti's a description of dividing line, a staggering economy, right? There is thinking about the violence. It draws us to think conceptually about the violence, to think about the very ways in which that violence is rendered possible by the sheer drawing of a line. You know, it's rendered possible by a boat. It's rendered possible by an aeroplane. All of which we draw lines. We fly on planes. We see boats and going off to the sunset. The very, very ordinary ways in which we respond, and which it's the mundane, the mundane aspects of the line and the boat and the plane that, in fact, we need to think about as they open into, these vistas of crisis that we do need to respond to, and are continuously responding inadequately.
Yeah, I think I was reading Zarina's work against some of the, images that we do get in the media, and the ways we are constantly inundated with what the crisis of the moment looks like, right? Whether it's a refugee crisis or a war or a famine or floods. And it's always there's a similarity to the way that they're not specific, and which is why in some ways, like in social media, there's often these mistakes or these glitches that go viral, right? You have certain images from one crisis being used mistakenly to spread awareness about another crisis. And it's the possibility of doing that is also precisely because of there's something non-specific about the images. After a while, they're all just grieving bodies or dead bodies, and there's no effort to really think through what exactly is being lost in that moment that's being captured. And what I really love about Zarina's work is the way in which it steps out of that. And it takes you out of that frame of, there's no humans in any of these pieces, but you see in a very stark way the technologies of control, the technologies of mobility that are then stopped, that collapse, the fragility of those technologies. These boats are just eventually paper boats, the way they collapse in the middle of the ocean. And that, I think, speaks to the violence of the border regime. We all talk about how artificial borders are and how borders were just the violence of just, some colonial official drawing a line on a map. But the very real violence that they involve, comes out in a much more profound way, I think, through your artwork than might be possible in a lot of the way photojournalism has been promoted, and the kind of photojournalism that is rewarded and becomes standard. And the only other thing I want to say is I think there's a way in which the journalism and photojournalism and the media and representations of violence are designed to consider the pain and suffering of others, right? And to create a response. But it's inherently flawed because it cannot imagine the people being represented except as victims in need of sympathy or in need of help, in need of saviors, which denies them any real humanity or agency. And what I also really appreciated about the works that I talked about by Zarina is there's the craft involved speaks to a kind of playfulness. The way I can't remember the name of the piece, but the folded piece of paper with the sort of the line running through it.
Yeah. The sinking boat.
The sinking boat, or like I think one of the pieces about the border that to me was evocative of a border, and the paper boat. There's a kind of playfulness and agency in it, and at every point a sense of, to me, it was very evocative of the role that so-called, and that allows you to think about this moment of crisis and the people on whom the crisis is being visited as something more than just victims, and as and I think even the vocabulary that we sometimes insist on, it's not a migrant crisis, it's a refugee crisis because these people deserve to come here. They didn't choose to leave. They had no choice. We must be humanitarian and let them in, and all of these different debates about who to let in and who's worthy of being let in and who's the perfect victim really leaves out so much of humanity and doesn't have any room to think about, the broad set of reasons why people might come and what constrained choices look like.
The second question I wanted to ask, and it's kind of playing, it's following on the previous one, is that in much of Zarina's work, there is a kind of as Vazira, you said, a re-territorialization that is happening. And, I've often been struck by the way in which certain sites are being evoked in a way that I think is speaking to a very particularly South Asian Muslim kind of imaginary. So cities such as Baghdad, Aleppo, Damascus, are grouped by her also along with New York City and Srebrenica. But I wanted to ask if, basically about the shift in the significance of these cities and these sites with the, increasing fragmentation of, basically with, I wanted to ask about the shift in significance in the roles of cities such as Baghdad, Aleppo, and Damascus in, that we can see through Zarina's work and also through kind of contemporary conditions of migration and refugees.
What I would like to say to that is, in terms of the South Asian imaginary and the South Asian Muslim imaginary and where the role the Middle East plays in that imaginary, it's interesting to think about how that's shifted over time, and the role that places like Baghdad or Damascus or Aleppo played at a certain moment, how that shifted, and was perhaps, deepened in a certain sense during the non-aligned movement, but then shifted in a very dramatic way after the 70s, after the oil boom, where you had a massive influx of South Asian workers going to oil-rich states of the Persian Gulf, but also to other destinations in the Arab Middle East, primarily, as working class labor, and it's definitely shifted the sense of how I think people living in the Middle East might look upon South Asian Muslims and South Asians in general. And the way, if you go to Beirut now, where certain neighborhoods are, what used to be an Armenian neighborhood is now, almost entirely a neighborhood of migrant workers from all over South Asia and the Philippines and parts of East Africa as well. And so there's a very different landscape, and when we talk about migration and the Middle East, right? Usually we think about people fleeing wars in Syria, from Damascus, from Aleppo, from Baghdad, but I think it's also interesting and important to complicate that story about migrants going from South Asia to the Middle East, if we're thinking particularly of what is this, what role does the Middle East occupy in a South Asian imaginary, and how that role might have shifted from a place of sort of a broader Muslim longing and solidarity to a place of employment, to a place of, where you, for the most part, end up getting into debt to get the money and pay the recruitment fees, and you go there to work in construction. Large parts of the Kurdish regional area, I don't even know what to call it anymore, but what might have been Kurdistan but is not in northern Iraq. Much of the construction, there's been a major construction boom there, much of the construction was done by South Asian workers. In Baghdad, US military bases across Iraq were staffed by South Asian workers who were setting up the bases, cooking the food, cleaning up for American soldiers. So there's many different sort of things that these places might now mean to people in South Asia.
And I think that's a really valuable re-territorializing, because I was going to say that if in the mid-20th century the figure of the Jew was enormously important for rethinking the kind of, to again go back to the word humanity, what the condition of humanity might look like, then in this moment, the category Muslim has that reverberation. It is that category that as such doesn't matter whether it's India or Pakistan or Baghdad, Iraq or New York. or Paris today, the category Muslim moves and functions and has accrued a kind of intensity that from which we must begin to ask questions about how we think about humanity. But what I liked about what Anjali said was we cannot leave out the circuits of labor and capital that underpin and undergird these movements of people in which this category, Muslim, has acquired a kind of specificity, right, which distinguishes it from South Asia or the Middle East. It doesn't matter where you're from. In some moment, right, that the category Muslim then overwhelms the regional linguistic specificity. I speak Urdu. It does not matter in a moment when the only category through which I may speak is that of a Muslim.
I'm going to problematize that issue, actually, of the Muslim being, in a sense, in the afterlife, and maybe in the economy of the way the Jew became a certain figure in the 20th century, only because I think that Muslim in the contemporary moment is very much shaped by the, let's say, the legacy of colonialism and the continuation of what we might call neo-colonialism or neo-imperialism. And this question of war, which is, we're talking about migrants, questions of labor and borders, but there's also a very real question of a shifting kind of geopolitics in which after the Cold War, the US, comes into power in a very significant way. And my feeling a little bit is that this category of Muslim is, while it's a very vulnerable kind of category on the one hand, on the other, there's a way in which it's emerging, almost in the way that during partition, certain shared linguistic or shared regional ideas of belonging became replaced by, let's say, certain separations like Hindu or Muslim, right? You have certain categories emerging with the independence of India, Pakistan, and then later Bangladesh that start to, although we have, for example, East and West Pakistan, you have Muslims on both sides, but language becomes, language and territory and power become very divisive issues. And I think Muslim today, right now, in the States and in Western Europe particularly, is becoming racialized in a certain sense that feels very unfamiliar to me. Or it feels like something that I feel very wary of, actually, thinking of a category of broad Muslim in a sense. And I wonder about this new entry of a form of a racialized figure, of a religion that previously didn't exist. And I mean, for just example, in Zarina's prints, like in these cities blotted by wilderness, I believe it is, where you have Ahmedabad, Srebrenica, you have New York, etc. There's something I think very significant in that, in her work, in its non-representational. It's not figurative. It's not representational in terms of showing us. I mean, and perhaps I'm using the work to think through this, where I think it shows us the fault lines of belonging and identity formation, but without putting forward. Let's say instead of putting forward a singular figure of a Muslim, there is a kind of imaginary that I'm calling a kind of South Asian Muslim imaginary, right? Where sites of pilgrimage, or sites that you find shrines in Delhi or in Lahore that are shrines of that are believed to be shrines of Sufis who've come from Iraq, for example. So I'm just to stir it up a bit, but I think Muslim is being racialized more than it's just a certain kind of a category of belonging.
I would say racialization or race lies at the very heart of the making of the modern world. And the initial encounter of the European in the Americas was where racialization became the basis of, say, those who were civilized and those who were not, and therefore could be conquered and subjugated. It's foundational to the modern world we live in. And so you can see it moves, and different groups of people have been racialized, or racialization intensifies. It creates a field of discourse and conversation and incarceration and so on and so forth. But that it's to say that the Muslim is racialized now and was not before is to merely say that the categories of racialization have always been contingent upon the geopolitics of both capital and colonialism. One could say imperialism as writ today. So I wouldn't think of it as something that's separable. I think you're also gesturing to that. It's not separable from our larger history of the modern world, this moment in that sense, and this category in that sense. Not to be singular, but rather that it's made to do more work than really than it should.
Absolutely, race is at the center. Race and racialization is at the center of, controlling populations around the world. But I think if you look at the Middle East, for example, it's interesting to look at what the way in Muslim majority countries in the Arab Middle East, how does the category of the Muslim function, right? Where within the logic of the war on terrorism, you have certain kinds of, Muslim practices that are deemed that can be criminalized. Certain kinds of ways of being a Muslim at different points have become dangerous to the point of ending up in prison, getting massacred in Egypt, 2013 after Rabaa. Certain kinds of political allegiances of showing your faith in a certain way, in a political sense, right, becomes criminalized in different parts of the Middle East, and then, which seems like less of a racialization, but where it does function, I think, in a racial way, and what's interesting is, just to take a very sort of example from out there, but like, if you look at the people who've joined ISIS, and the people who've come from South Asia to join ISIS, which is, not terribly large numbers, but you look at some of the narratives of people who've left, it's very interesting to hear them talk about wanting to join ISIS because they saw themselves as a certain kind of Muslim and part of a certain kind of Muslim imaginary, but when they were in Syria or Iraq, they were treated very badly by some of the senior ISIS members who were Syrian or Iraqi or Arab. And they felt racialized in that experience of this, very extreme version of an idealized Islamic state. So even within that, there's a way in which being a South Asian Muslim was seen as, they ended up doing the manual labor.
I mean, and I should say, when I say the racialization, I mean within a Western context of course, because we can't, it's very difficult to talk globally about the question of Islam, and I wouldn't be able to do that, and I wouldn't want us to be doing that. Just so when I'm saying it, I mean within like America and Western Europe, definitely.
No,
But you don't have to be a Muslim to be racialized as Muslim, right?
Right.
Or in the example that Anjali just gave, I would say within a field of being Muslim, there are other bars of Muslim / racialization that happen. So,
Right. Within
so
the community,
it's not actually tied to a fact or a set of facts, but rather moves discursively and resonates differently in different moments. And the fact that it can do all that kind of work, right, is quite important.
Can I just say that we were going to take questions from the audience on cards, which I believe we have we have taken them, and I have in front of me a question from the audience. So I'll take this question for the panel, and then I will invite Zarina on stage, or I should invite her now. Then, so let's join hands and welcome Zarina on stage.
The heartbeat is basically my own heartbeat. My cardiologist, we have become great friend, and everybody, he takes my cardiogram. I said, could you give me a printout? And he does. So it's real. And
there I
I
thought it was
don't
gonna be-
feel as a victim, or I don't apologize for being a Muslim, because we don't choose where we will be born, because, and I do have, people might not. I mean, I tried very hard to be a sort of a modern secular person, but I do have an inner life, and it will always remain so. And this is the way, and I have other identities too, because I go to the synagogues, and I go to churches, and I go to, when I want. So it's not, my parents are sort of very conventional, but they never stopped me. If I wanted to go to, visit wherever, and any languages, because I was fairly fearless, and still I am. So,
So I'll ask this question that came from the audience, and maybe also
For me?
Zarina, I'll maybe direct to you also part of that question.
yes.
So the question says, I appreciated Anjali's reading of the work Starting Over, which is up on the screen. Can you, Anjali or Sadia, say more about the way it functions very differently from the other images that are gouged out? This one is raised rather than the abyss. Wait, sorry. Can you say more about the way it functions very differently from the other images that are gouged out? Sure, please.
So I was saying I appreciated your reading that to me, and I would love actually both Zarina and Sadia to talk a little bit more about this image, because it seems quite different from the others. And I was saying the other, like the dividing line, is literally about space. It's about
Do you mean the Red Cliff line?
I mean, actually, what I was going to say about that work too, this work Starting Over, is very much about the process by which Zarina is making it, and I'll let you explain a little bit actually how you've been making these works. She's been making a series of works actually like this that I'll let you explain.
I just got tired of the machine-made paper, and I thought I will just crush it. And then when I had my retrospective, and I called it paper like skin, because it naturally ages, like and I think I don't believe in restoration, and so I'm not a believer in Botox. this is the way I come, and of course I don't look like a rag when I go out, but I'm not, and if I'm a believer, I'm a believer in science. I think I do like science very much, and also being, I think the greatest part, what I have enjoyed is being a teacher, because because I come from a family of teachers, and I think that when you touch somebody's life, and I think it's great, and after here I ended up teaching in Santa Cruz. And students wouldn't come, and I said, "Where were you?" And I'll chase them. And, and they said, "Oh, it was such a beautiful wave." So they went surfing. But you see that I learned a lot from that. And I think faith, religion is a very small part of the culture, and sometimes, I like language, I like words very much, but I think sometimes it's good not to go back home, because it's not, I think it's better to dream about it, because it's not what we left. And, but if you never left, you wouldn't know what was outside. But when you're young, you want to go out and see what is there. I do question my own belief also, which I think at a certain time we were allowed to. That, I was just reading somewhere that why did you make me and you brought me in this world? Couldn't you just sort of roast a camel or an elephant or a rhinoceros? And why you made human beings, Because even if you have a chickpea, it wants to jump out. Because they all are living creatures. So I think people who are very faithful to religion, they have no sense of humor. And I think that is with the fundamentalist, I feel. They have absolutely no sense of humor. So
Well,
what else is there?
So, I don't know, I think you've covered it all. Do you want to talk a little bit about in response to the question, a bit about the starting over?
I think your question was more to Zarina and Sadia, right? Yeah. I'm happy to talk
So,
more,
I can say a little bit about what I know about Zarina's process in relation to this.
And I really don't care about Urdu too, because
That was unexpected.
yes, but you see, so what? There are other languages which are, very beautiful.
That's true.
And they are, so once somebody was trying to be very rude to me, and I said, don't try. I can be rude in many languages. But it's, I think we have to respect each other. And, if somebody called your prophet, made a cartoon of him, he's still, if you're a believer, he's still a prophet. Why can't just let it go, And then more people are dying, protecting him.
So, may I say a little
Sure,
about
sure.
just about the process of this piece, and then you should.
Yes, process. Because the thing is that one side is very practical of me. I had a small car, and I measured it. If I could go into it will fit in this, I will take it. And also when you're traveling, you don't become an architect, because, it is like moving. So everything was measured by what could fit in my car.
So, I mean, I think the question of scale, I mean, as Zarina is saying, you know, I think her works have generally been a certain scale that is manageable for her to do within the space of her studio, and her studio is also her, like, where she lives, her living space. And so I think actually the scale of the work is quite important and interesting. I think when
I think it's sort of, I like small.
Yeah, you like small things, and then also I think it gave you a certain control. It gave you the ability. She was quite practical in terms of also what she had available to her at that time, being able to work with that. And the kind of paper pulp sculptures that I was showing on the slides were also these experiments she was doing. They're in conjunction with her teaching at the New York Feminist Art Institute, et cetera, at the same time. And again, they're all of a certain scale. It's a very, I think the hand is very important to her. And the kind of, the ectogram, the line of the echocardiogram, and the question of the hand, I think, and the question of scale are things that recur in her work. And her work is very process-based as well, I think. It didn't have a certain DIY aesthetic of feminist kind of work in the 70s. It was very pristine, beautiful paper, materials. She cared for the work in a certain way. And this last piece, starting over, is, interesting because it's, I don't know if it's actually handmade paper or if it's machine-made paper. It's handmade. So it's handmade paper that she's kind of crushed. And so there are a series of prints that are using this kind of crushed handmade paper and then collaging them into these small prints. So this image, I mean, which is, I'm also quite moved by it, is, handmade paper that's been crushed in, by hand, and then just mounted as such on the page. And I mean, I think that there's also, the question of kind of ability and disability that's going on in Zarina's later work. And, I would say that you're continuing to make things by hand in certain ways that are very expressive. And
but that is what, somebody asked me, I was in a panel, and he said, you don't make figures because you are a Muslim. And I said, yes, just like Ed Reinhardt. I mean, what does that mean? Right. Because, you sort of, and I will lie if I think that, I haven't looked at other people's work, which you see lots of images come right off, Pefner and Gabo, and I was inspired by them. So it's not that we don't learn from other people. And I think this whole thing, I don't know, I'm bored with Muslim identity. Don't even put my work there.
I agree with that. And no better note than that to close on. Thank you all in the audience for coming with us and staying with us through the discussion. Again, thank you to NYU for hosting us and the panelists, and of course, Zarina.
And I think it's good to be with atheists sometime. And I feel sometimes that, even questioning my belief too, which is okay. I think if Allah has other lot of time, then just sort of persecuting me. But he's, as it is, very busy.
He's busy. I'm sorry he can't join us for refreshments, but all of you can.
Yes.
Okay, thank you again.